Okay, so have you ever been driving like totally in the zone
Yeah.
and then suddenly your passenger like turns into a stunt driver? You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
You look over and they're like bracing for impact, holding on for dear life.
Yeah, gripping the dashboard.
Yeah, maybe even like a little gasp as you're coming to a completely normal stop
Right.
at a red light.
Like they thought you were going to blow through it.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
That's what we're diving into today. The whole world of driver and passenger dynamics.
Mm.
And you know what's cool is you guys sent in some really interesting stuff about like the psychology behind this.
Yeah.
Not just the funny stuff, but also like the actual tensions that can happen.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's this really simple thing. Sharing a car
Right.
turns into this like mini social experiment. You know, it shows how we deal with trust and control and even like how we see risk.
Yeah. You know what? One of the articles you sent in talked about how being a driver is kind of like being a performer,
Oh, interesting.
even if we don't realize it.
Mm.
Like we're not just getting from point A to B. We're also like subconsciously trying to project this image of like, hey, I'm competent, you know?
Yeah, I
Hey,
got
got
the
this.
story.
I'm in control.
Right, and that's where it gets interesting because while the driver's trying to keep it cool,
Yeah.
the passenger is often having a totally different experience.
Right.
They're not in control, so
Yeah.
their anxieties can go wild.
Totally.
Suddenly, like, every lane change is a near-death experience, and every roundabout's like a demolition derby waiting to happen.
Oh my gosh, I'm totally picturing myself right now, like white-knuckling it in the passenger seat and questioning every single move.
It's a primal thing. You know, the passenger is literally putting their life in someone else's hands.
Right.
It's no wonder all those feelings of vulnerability come up.
Yeah.
And that can lead to all sorts of interesting behaviors, like a
Like backseat drive.
backseat driving. Exactly.
Like the classic.
The classic car companion.
I read this study where they actually measured drivers' stress levels with and without backseat drivers.
Oh, wow.
And you know what? Stress levels went through the roof when there was somebody in the passenger seat offering up their helpful advice.
Yeah, that makes sense, though, because you're trying to focus on the road and process all this information as a driver.
Right.
And then suddenly you've got this other voice chiming in, adding to the mental load.
Right.
It's like trying to solve a hard math problem while someone's whispering random numbers in your ear.
That's a good analogy.
It's just too much.
Yeah. So how do we avoid becoming those dreaded backseat drivers?
Right.
Is it all about just like keeping our mouths shut?
Well, silence isn't always the answer, especially if you actually see a safety concern.
Right.
It's about finding that sweet spot between giving some feedback that's actually helpful
Right.
and respecting that the driver needs to concentrate.
Okay, so let's say I'm in the passenger seat
Okay.
and I notice that the driver is getting a little too close for comfort to the car in front of us.
Mm-hmm.
What's a good way to say something? Instead of yelling, watch out.
Yeah, instead of freaking out,
Right.
you could try something like, hey, I'm feeling a little cramped in here.
All right.
Would you mind giving us a bit more space from that car?
I like that.
You know?
It brings up the concern, but it doesn't sound like you're accusing them or making them feel bad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, if you're the driver,
Yeah.
remember that communication goes both ways.
Mm-hmm.
If your passenger's chatting your ear off and you're feeling overwhelmed,
Yeah.
it's totally okay to politely ask them to give you a little space so you can focus.
Right. So basically just set those boundaries.
Yeah, set those boundaries.
One of the articles even said that setting boundaries is like super important for both sides,
Absolutely.
drivers and passengers.
Yeah.
It's all about respecting each other's roles and understanding that everybody in the car wants to have a good experience.
Everyone wants to get there safely and enjoy the ride.
Right. And speaking of enjoying the ride, let's talk about road trips.
Ooh, yes.
Because if a short drive can bring out those driver-passenger dynamics,
Yeah.
a multi-day road trip is like putting it under a microscope.
Oh, yeah. Road trips can be the ultimate test.
Right. Like hours and hours together in that car
You see it all.
brings out the best and the worst.
The good, the bad, and the ugly.
Right. And it's not just personality clashes either.
Right.
Road trips involve so many decisions, like navigation and pit stops, music,
Yeah.
and those can be major arguments if they're not handled well.
Absolutely. Major points of contention.
One of the sources had this idea of a road trip contract.
A contract.
Yeah, basically like a pre-trip agreement
Interesting.
where everybody says what their expectations are,
Okay.
what they prefer, and even like deal breakers.
I like that.
It might sound a little over the top,
Yeah.
but it's actually a good idea, especially for longer trips.
Yeah, like a little constitution for your car.
Yeah,
So you don't have those arguments about music or how often to stop for snacks.
I kind of love that idea.
Yeah.
I'm picturing it now, like meticulously outlining
Yes.
snack preferences, and veto power over certain radio stations.
Right? Maybe even some quiet time built in.
Yes. Designated quiet time.
Don't wait the introverts in the car.
It might sound silly,
Yeah.
but it's about setting those expectations.
Yeah. Clear expectations.
And making sure everybody's on the same page.
Exactly. And that, I think, is at the heart of what makes those driver-passenger dynamics work.
Yeah.
Whether it's a quick trip or a cross-country adventure.
So we've talked about the anxieties and potential conflicts,
Yeah.
but also the fun and even the humor.
Right.
But before we wrap up this part of the deep dive, I have a question.
Okay.
We've been focused on the literal act of driving, but do you think these same dynamics play out in other parts of life?
Oh, that's a great question.
Where one person's kind of in control
Yeah.
and the other person is along for the ride?
I think so. And that's something we'll explore more in the next part.
Okay.
Because those driver and passenger roles aren't limited to just cars. You know, think about work relationships, friendships, even families. Those same power dynamics, those same anxieties and chances for connection, they're all there.
That's something for you to think about as we head into part 2.
Yeah, how do those dynamics show up in your life?
We'll be back to break it all down. Welcome back.
Yeah.
You know, I was just thinking, in some ways, life itself is like one giant road trip. You know, there are times when we're in the driver's seat making all the decisions.
Right.
And then other times we're the passenger just trusting someone else to get us where we need to go.
Yeah, it's a powerful analogy.
Yeah.
Just like in a car, the dynamic between that driver and passenger can make or break the whole experience.
You know what else I thought was interesting? One of the sources mentioned how those roles can actually switch even within the same relationship.
Oh, yeah.
Depending on what's going on.
Right. It's not always the same person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like you might be the driver when it comes to like planning vacations, but your partner might be the one in charge of the finance.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And I think that back and forth can actually be a good thing.
Okay.
It creates more balance, you know? Right.
Both people feel like they have a say.
Right. But what happens when those roles get too rigid? You know, like one person's always calling the shots.
Right.
And the other one feels like they're just along for the ride.
Yeah. That can be a recipe for disaster.
Right.
It can breed resentment and frustration.
Yeah.
And even like a sense of powerlessness.
It's like being stuck in a car with a driver who won't stop for bathroom breaks.
Oh, yeah.
Or let you pick the music.
Or even worse, like controls the air conditioning.
Yeah, that's the worst.
Yeah, you're going to hit a breaking point eventually.
And that's why it's so important to pay attention to these dynamics. Not just in relationships, but in all parts of life.
Absolutely. It's everywhere.
So let's say you're at work
Okay.
and you feel like you're constantly being micromanaged. It's like having that backseat driver looking over your shoulder.
Right. Questioning every move.
Yeah. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think the first thing is to try and understand where they're coming from. Are they actually worried about something?
Right.
Or is it more about them needing to be in control?
Once you kind of figure out their motivation, then
You can start to communicate more effectively. You know,
Okay.
maybe they don't even realize how their feedback is affecting you.
Right.
And just having a conversation can help shift things.
So what would you say? Like, what's a good way to approach that?
We could say something like, hey, I appreciate your input, but I also need some space to try things my own way. I'll definitely come to you if I hit a roadblock.
I like that.
It's assertive, but not aggressive.
Right.
You're setting a boundary, but you're keeping the lines of communication open.
Yeah. And now let's flip it around. What if you're the one who's usually in the driver's seat? Whether it's at work or with friends or even in your family.
Right.
How can you make sure you're not accidentally creating that power imbalance?
I think the key is to be mindful of the other person. You know, are you giving them enough space to share their ideas and make their own decisions? Are you really listening to their concerns?
Right.
Or are you just waiting for your turn to talk?
Yeah, it's easy to fall into that trap, especially when you're used to being the one in charge.
It is. But even small changes can make a big difference.
Like what?
Instead of jumping in with solutions when someone comes to you with a problem,
Yeah.
try asking them, what do you think would be the best way to handle this?
I like that. It shows you respect their opinion.
Right. And it gives them the power to come up with the solution,
Which is a good thing.
which can be really empowering.
One thing I found really interesting was this idea that sometimes the passenger actually prefers to be the passenger.
Oh, that's a good point.
You know, maybe they're more comfortable letting someone else take the lead.
Right. Maybe they don't have the energy to be the driver at that moment.
Yeah. Or maybe they just trust the other person's judgment.
Exactly. The important thing is that everyone feels good about the dynamic
Right.
and that there's mutual respect.
So we've talked about workplaces and relationships and families, But what about like those bigger systems? Like in society where the power dynamics are way more complex.
Right.
Can you even apply these same ideas of communication and trust and shared decision-making on that kind of scale?
It's definitely harder.
Yeah.
But I think it's crucial to at least try.
One of the articles talked about the importance of citizen engagement.
Yes.
Making sure that the people in power are actually listening to the people they represent.
Absolutely. And that requires us to be informed and to speak up and to hold our leaders accountable.
It's like being a passenger who's not afraid to say something when the driver's going the wrong way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We all have a role to play in shaping the direction of our communities and the world.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation.
Yeah.
And I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, there's so much more to explore.
Before we wrap up this part, I want to leave our listeners with something to consider.
Okay.
Are there any areas in your life where you're always the driver? And could you benefit from sharing the wheel a bit more?
Interesting.
Or maybe the opposite. Are there situations where you've gotten too comfortable being the passenger?
Right.
And maybe you need to step up and take more initiative?
Good questions.
We'll be back in part 3 to dive even deeper into this. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It's amazing how these driver and passenger dynamics apply to so much more than just being in a car.
Yeah. It's like a secret code in our interactions.
Right.
Once you start seeing it, you see it everywhere.
Everywhere. So we've talked about the potential problems like those power struggles and communication breakdowns.
Right.
But I'm curious, what are the good parts of having these roles? Can they be a source of strength or connection?
Absolutely. When things are balanced and flexible, those roles can actually help build trust and make things more collaborative.
Okay.
And even help people grow. Think about like a mentor and a mentee.
Okay.
In a way, the mentor is kind of like the driver guiding and supporting the mentee.
I like that.
Yeah.
And in that situation, both people win. The mentor gets to share what they know, and the mentee gets all this great advice.
Exactly. And as the mentee learns and grows, they might even become the driver someday.
Right.
And start mentoring someone else.
One of the articles talked about this idea of flexible leadership in teams.
Oh, yeah.
Like, the leader doesn't have to be the same person all the time.
Right.
It can change depending on what's happening and who has the right skills at that moment.
It's like a relay race, passing the baton
I love that analogy.
to whoever's the best for that part of the race.
And when a team can do that, they can be way more creative and make better decisions.
Yeah, and it makes everyone feel like they're really part of the team.
But let's be honest. It's hard to let go of the wheel sometimes,
It is.
even when it's the right thing to do.
Wow.
Why do we hold on so tight?
I think it comes down to control. Or at least feeling like we have control.
Yeah.
We live in a world with so much uncertainty.
Right.
So being the driver can feel like a way to handle that anxiety. Like if I'm the one making decisions, then at least I know what's going to happen.
But it's not really true, is it?
Not always. We can't predict everything.
And trying to control everything can actually make things worse.
Exactly. It can create tension and stop us from enjoying those spontaneous moments.
So it's all about finding that balance.
Right. Being assertive, but not bossy.
Supportive, but not taking over.
That's the key to making those driver-passenger dynamics work.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one thing you hope people will remember?
Just be aware of those roles you play.
Okay.
And think about how you handle them. Ask yourself, where am I comfortable being the driver? Where am I happy to be the passenger? And are there places where I need to change things up, maybe share the wheel more, or maybe step up and take more initiative?
It's not about always being the driver.
Right.
It's about making the journey enjoyable for everyone.
Exactly.
Well said. This has been a really interesting deep dive. And I bet we'll all start noticing these dynamics everywhere we go now.
I think so.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.